Okay, in this video I want to do a final exam review to help you put the pieces together from everything you've done over the last 6 weeks. So I want to just go over the learning outcomes again. The idea here is that you need to show me these 6 things. So what you need to show me is not your ability to repeat the words of these outcomes, but to show me that you understand them and that you can apply them to new situations, which will require you to do analysis. So you have to show me that you understand that the legal system in the United States in the Constitution is formed through a property first point of view, and that property first point of view reinforces the social exclusion of those who are not white, those who are not men, and those who are not property holders. What you'll then see is our policing system, the most dominant approach is the broken windows theory, and that this represents the dominant cultural view on exclusion, right? Its intent is to exclude, so it's not about fairness. And this obviously hurts minority views and minority points of view like community policing and other ideas. Now, this is part of a historical understanding, and that was shown in one of your readings very clearly, that through legal opinions and through the legal applications over the last 300 years have been largely dominated by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men. And yet these also influence how all Americans think about rights, social control, crime, and liberty, what I'm referring to in this class as myths. Now we want to apply that to an actual situation so that I can see that you understand these principles through the example of homelessness. So the construct of racial capitalism going back to 200 years before the Constitution was written and enshrined those legal values through the Constitution then helps you better understand why gentrification occurs. It's because of the property first constitutional narrative. It's not about equality of humans. This leads to the displacement of people, and that displacement then feeds into the broken windows theory of criminalization. So this is not the end of the story. On the one hand, the legal narrative on one edge of the sword is this idea of domination. But as you've kind of hopefully seen in this class, that sense of unfairness, that sense of inequality also creates a contradiction where people say, well, this isn't right. I should have the right to resist this domination. And so this is the other edge of the sword. And so it's the domination that leads to this concept that people start to think about as rights as being fairness. But these understandings, these meanings are formed from metaphors that lead to our narratives, and these occur within our social groups. So that's educational environments, your family environment. If you're involved in religious or sports or cultural activities, that's those environments. And then your economic situation. So I wanted to put this kind of all on one slide so you could see how everything works together. So the property first narratives in orange, those represent the dominant view, or law as a game. And you can see that very clearly in the broken windows reading, the Wickard versus Philborn, and the Marshall Trilogy cases, where you see there's a formal law is to the benefit of those who have access to the law, who have property, and who quote unquote know the rules of the game because they've gone through this game many times. It excludes the other people. And so those groups have come up with resistance narratives. And you saw that in the power of self-definition, the confronting class reading, all eyes are on you, and fire this time. But notice that those aren't really coming out in the formal law, and you'll see that's because the formal law benefits white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men and their narrative. The resistant narrative is the one that's responding to that. So that's the other side of the sword. Now, the double-edged sword is a euphemism, or it's an idiom, a phrase that we use that has an origin outside of the English United States constitutional system, but it has been applied. And Justice Story really applied this metaphor in the Law Amistad case, where he was looking at the principles of the right to be left alone and arguing that slaves should have the right to overthrow their masters. Now, you'll learn again, right, in this class that that goes up against the domination narrative. So that was a resistance narrative. It made it into a court case, but it didn't get applied during the Marshall era. Justice Marshall went a different direction and focused on the other edge of the sword. And so this goes back to the metaphor really influences how you view dominance or resistance. And then intersectionality is when you're able to apply the critical analysis of race, gender, and class to a particular case study, which I gave you as X, and you'll see a version of that again. And then the legal narratives, again, those are based on your metaphors about morality that you've gotten through your family, through education, through the economy, and through other social groupings. Now, what seems to be new for a lot of students is that what I'm asking you to do here is in the middle of this Bloom's taxonomy, this learning process called applying, and then working up to analyzing. This is a skill that you really have to have before you graduate from Kingsborough, especially if you intend to transfer to the four-year college, because they're going to expect you to not only be able to analyze, but also to evaluate and to create new theory. You start off in high school and undergraduate when you started as a freshman, really just remembering things or trying to remember things. Hopefully over time, the theory goes that if you can remember a number of things, you'll start to understand them better. But by the time you get to a class like constitutional law, you should have remembered and understood a lot of things from your American government, from sociology, from a variety of classes. And so now you're supposed to be applying and analyzing those concepts and really looking for the flaws and the contradictions and understanding that this isn't simply just about ideals. It's not just about memorizing definitions. So it's kind of like working your way up and then over towards creating. So from week 6, I really hope that you kind of saw this, because fairness is a concept that is very common among Kingsborough students, very common among immigrants, very common among women of color, and people who are first in their family to go to college. This can be explained through the nurturing parent metaphor, that law as social control is like a good parent that's providing access, that's providing equity, that's providing help, right? So that's that kind of idea that I can possess rights or I can possess equality through the law. However, that's not the common narrative that you'd read about in 1776 among white men. The common norm of that time, and largely among men today, is that of the right to be left alone, or your inequality is your problem. I have what I need. I don't need to worry about you. So that's the myth of individualism. And so the myth of individualism fits really well as a dominant narrative with the law narrative, meaning that they see it as a game, and so long as they're winning the game, then it's fair for them. And this leads to the concept of due process, that as long as the quote-unquote rules of the game are fair, meaning that I'm winning the game, then it works for me. When people start to experience unfairness in the law, then they see it as being not objective and fair, but rather as arbitrary and capricious and working against them. And there's lots of evidence of this, especially for women of color and immigrants. And so the resist the law, or the Black Lives Matter movement is a great example. That's more of a narrative that's explaining the inequality. And so that's why the ideals come out of that narrative. And then the before the law, this is people who kind of see it almost as a religious experience, right? That it's this thing that you can't really change, and then it's somehow distant from you, or they start to believe it as a thing, that it's out there and it automatically applies. Now, these are kind of people who they want to believe in the law. They want to believe it's an ideal. This is what a lot of your family members and friends kind of said it. They want it to be something that gives you consequences if you violate some rule. The problem is it's not a thing, right? And so it can't do anything. So it's only really based on how we perceive. So kind of before the law is a very kind of naive or a childlike kind of idea of that life should be fair. The rules should be in place. The law should be one thing. It's what we teach children. And so it's not unexpected that people, when they reach adulthood, still believe in this thing. But through experience, your narrative starts to change to either with the law, you see it as being helpful for you, and it's a tool where it helps you win a game, or as resisting the law, where it's this thing that's getting in your way and is leading to discrimination. And that's largely based on your social group, and racial capitalism. Are you being favored or are you being discriminated against? So a lot of people believe in this myth, and I wanted you really to wrestle with this and to see that on the one hand, you're getting cases and readings and college level thinking that shows you that these myths aren't real. But if you just simply go back to your everyday experience, people believe in these myths, but they believe in different versions of this myth. And so that's where you start to be able to critically analyze that all of these things can't be true at the same time for it to be universal and apply to everyone. Now, I want to be clear, this is what people really believe, and so they behave accordingly. And so lots of people think that the law should be used as a tool for social control, but other people believe it should be a tool to protect white males and their privilege. And so you see that those two things are a contradiction. That's the reality of the situation we live in. Law is a contradiction. It isn't one thing. So again, it's not one thing, and even to speak about law is kind of silly. We do it a lot. I do it, because that's how I was taught. But in reality, there's thousands and hundreds of thousands of laws. It's a plural thing. But then it's also not really a thing, right? It's not the pipe. It's a picture. It's a representation. It's an idea. And so these are different ideas, different phrases, different meanings, different norms. And so these are all ideas that can be very easily interpreted based on your own experience. And these are based on your family and your social group. And so they're going to conflict in these spaces where we share with each other. But the majority views, the historical majority views, the ones of people in power, those are the ones that begin to dominate. And so you kind of think about it if there was no resistance, if people just submitted all the time to what the historical white male Anglo-Saxon Protestant kind of norms were, right? Women would not be voting, right? People of color would still be slaves, right? So it's not that the norms changed. It's not that the laws changed. It's that the people resisted. They formulated new narratives. And so that's, it's a good thing. It's not a thing. It's not a pipe. It's not one solid thing. It's something that changes based on how people kind of push back. In theory, it could become that ideal, right? People could stop using it as a dominant tool for their own benefit. But there's really kind of concrete ways that would have to occur over a long time. And one of those concrete ways would have to be our metaphors would have to change. We'd have to stop using metaphors based in banking, right? Which, try to think about it this way. 1,000 years ago, people didn't use metaphors based in banking. That's because we have a banking system that developed in the 14 and 1500s. People started using banking systems to explain moral behavior. This then also leads to ideas about how the family and how the country should be run. And so either the strict father model or the nurturing parent model. And so these metaphors are really a reflection of our society, and then they inform our ideas and how we behave in society. So it kind of goes both ways. So it's easier to start thinking about law as a map, right? And here the elephant is the map, and people are all at different parts of the map. They experience the map differently. And just try to remember, the map is not the territory. It's not reality. It's not really the elephant. It's just what you think the elephant is. So law is based on what you think it is and the group around you. And so everybody's going to have different expectations about the law. And here are some of the most common ones. The right to be left alone. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant males, generally from the Puritan background, that's their concept. An ideal for punishment, you get what you deserve. That tends to be more for religious people who kind of see law as almost like, the punishment of God or karma, right? Those kind of ideas. The ideal for social control, where everyone will be judged, right? That's a little bit, I think there's some religion in there as well, but there's also this idea that it's automatic, that it's a tool for justice, that it's almost like a superhero, right? And that's how those people believe. And the ideal for rights, right? This is what is called natural law or human rights law. This is that because you were born, right? Because biologically we're all born equal, that there should be equality before the law. However, right, none of these are correct. They're not accurate representations of reality. They're not the elephant. There are different ideas of what we think law is. So this should be clear now why we get different interpretations. The different interpretations are based on the politics around us. So Lots of people believe that law is neutral and that judges are neutral, but in reality that doesn't make any sense. Judges are human beings, right? Lawyers are human beings, legislators are human beings. So they're biased based on their backgrounds, their social groups, and their politics. And so we need to understand that law is political. So you see this in the healthcare example I gave you, and these follow very closely the strict father and nurturing parent metaphors. You're more likely to be in favor of rights and taking care of poor people if you believe in the nurturing parent metaphor. You're more likely to be against or suspicious of people who are claiming that they need help if you're from the strict father metaphor experience. And so that's going to inform how you think about the law and what it's supposed to do. Is it supposed to be for equality, or is it supposed to separate the strong from the weak? So then this now should bring into focus the myth of Callahan versus Carey. We saw at the right side, we see the nurturing parent model, where those who are working really hard to get that case in New York State, they believed that it was a quote-unquote landmark case, that it provided the legal right to shelter. That's the myth. That's the ideal. The reality is still exclusion, right? During the pandemic, people in the Bronx have been getting evicted. The number of people who are staying in shelters have grown longer, right? So people aren't really being treated equally, right? They're just kind of getting stuck in these shelters. And then two groups have been treated differently in the shelter situation over the pandemic, right? So there are more homeless individuals who are seeking shelter, but families are getting placed, right? So you're seeing unequal treatment there as well. And so what I'm just trying to show you is that it's not that the people who are for Callahan for Carey, who say that housing is a human right, it's not that they're wrong. They're just looking at a different part of the elephant. So our job as students and as critical analysts is to look at the whole elephant. We're trying to get the whole big picture by collecting all the different ways that people see this issue of homelessness. We can then analyze that through intersectionality. So I gave you some more resources, some articles that give you the legality narratives of domination and of resistance, and to help you understand the limits of law and the metaphors we use. And then I gave you some interactive tools and multimedia where you can learn more about how capitalism and how racism working together are what create these discriminatory acts. So it's a systemic issue. It's not an individual preference issue. And so people tend to get confused because they think there's just individual bad actors instead of seeing that the system produces these effects. One of the major, very difficult things for people to understand is that, and I like these three answers because they helped show me you understand this. And there's a book that you can read on your own, or you could go to the YouTube video here, Not a Nation of Immigrants, that really goes into detail to help you understand how these early legal cases benefited white men and excluded these social groups like American Indians, African Americans, immigrants, right? Lots of different groups over a 150-year period that still explain why people believe we're a nation of immigrants when that is not true in the legal and political sense, because people want to believe in a concept, an ideal of an immigrant nation, but the reality doesn't match that situation. And so the law has been consistently used by white men against other people in order to enforce white male rights and exclude other people from getting those rights at all. And so several of you showed me that you understand it. I have to, you have to try, if you didn't understand this and you thought that these cases stood for treating American Indians well or fairly, I understand that you really strongly believe in that myth of fairness. But you need to go back and reread those cases because that's not what happened. Same situation in Wickard versus Filburn. A couple students got confused and thought things worked out well. That's not what happened. So I added a cartoon here where the child is saying, I got bad news, right? Dad's saying that he can take away my allowance based on the Commerce Clause in the United States Constitution. Again, until the 1930s, courts didn't really use this. They didn't say that the government could interfere with people's lives. That would go against the norms of that time. But as the politics changed, as the demographics changed, as more immigrants moved into the country, as the economy got bigger, as corporations got more power, the narrative began to change, right? Or it got challenged, really. It didn't change, it got challenged. So the right to be left alone is now being challenged by the right of social control. So those two myths are coming into conflict with each other beginning in the 30s. And so you're starting to see resistance to the domination really starting to take off in the 1930s. There's new ideas that are being formed. So this should help you understand how norms are separate from rules and how rules are separate from laws, but those are socially constructed in groups, and that those work together within a social institution, like a court, like a policing, like corrections, that those are all separate, and that they're seeing cases very differently and they're seeing their jobs very differently, but they're all in the same system of racism. And that the goal in all of those systems at the end of the day is to grow the economy. And so we've got this property first, profit narrative over the equality of humans. And so this manifests, or you see it in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's in individual bias, where we see threat perception differently. So some people see people who are different than them or other than them, and they get scared. They're fearful. They think that they have conspiracy theories that these people are going to do things for them. We tend to call those stereotypes. But you can also see this in leadership models, right? Who gets access to being in charge of corporations? Who are our politicians, right? Who are judges and lawyers, right? You see that that's also an issue. It also gets into collective interests, right? Whether people are thinking about zero sum, they're constantly in competition, or are they more likely to cooperate? Are they thinking about morality narratives? It also goes to things like the way science is communicated, what people believe in, whether they believe in fake news, whether they think that there's such a thing as called science and climate change, right? People are very persuaded by the information and how it's being communicated. That's informed by their social context, which includes the rules that you follow in your workplace or in the school setting or at family. Those are all part of the larger social norms, but they're not the same thing. And so there's inequality based on how people build on those perceptions, the leadership, right? All these pieces together all form into what we're calling racial capitalism. The property first narrative plus racism is the system of creating value for white male citizens, which is the concept and the point of the United States Constitution. This then should be able to help you understand better some of the incomplete answers that you did in week 4, and you'll make sure that you are much better at explaining this whole system and how it works together in the final exam. But don't forget, this isn't the end of the story. One half of the story is the mobilization of bias. It's white men making sure that the laws and the Constitution protect their interests. But over time, people start to resist. They start to see law as fairness, as social control, as ways of going up against domination. And so you want to be able to put these two things in a conversation. That leads me to the last assignment that I gave you, is to here are some examples of people who are using law as a form of resistance. And so they're going up against domination in the housing issue. And so now you see, hopefully you want to give X some advice, would be to join one of these organizations. That would be the smartest way for X to get justice, instead of trying to do everything by themselves or just work harder. That's never going to work, because they're going to keep experiencing discrimination everywhere they go in the system. The only way to change the system is to get these social groups to work together and overcome the majority of people who are using the system to their advantage. Now, some of you have good questions about this you've raised. Part of that is you have to get white people in power to realize that they're using the tool of law as a game to the detriment of other people. So there's more psychology in that. They have to really challenge their own biases. They have to be able to talk about racism. They have to talk about sexism. They have to talk about economic poverty issues, right? And so a lot of folks don't want to talk about those things. So they're never going to change the system if they can't see their place in it. But there also has to be this social mobilization, people coming together and using tool of law now as a point of resistance, of saying, I'm not going to accept domination. That requires that group, right? People who see it that way, they have to confront their own myth. Law is not automatically going to do this for them, right? They have to go up against people who are using law as a game. And so the people who are before the law, that narrative, they're really the ones that are hurt the most from this system. And that's a large group. That's about 40% of the people are stuck in that kind of naive, childish idea that the law is going to protect them, when the other groups are saying the law is never going to protect you because of these other people who are using it as a game. And so you kind of now are able to see how are these organizations using resistance to go up against the people who are trying to dominate them. And specifically, their capitalists are trying to dominate the housing market by excluding people and using the property just for their own income, not having anything to do with human beings. And that's the great example there is Billionaires Row, where most of those units in those apartments don't have any humans in them. And so housing is not being used as a way to house people, it's being used as a way to store money. And so just think about money going in there. That's really the ultimate example, I can't think of a better one, as a property-first constitutional narrative. The argument for these people will be, I have the right to do that and you have to leave me alone. Whereas most of you are arguing in your work that that's not right, that there should be fairness, housing should be equal, and that should be a right. So those are in conflict, those two examples. So on the final exam, you'll be given a final case study, very similar to the midterm. So you need to be able to apply the course readings, the assignments, and your overall learning, and explain those 6 learning outcomes using your own words and to show me that you understand them. That will show me that you're able to critically analyze, and you should be able to do that through race, gender, and class to show that that's all part of the same discriminatory system. Finally, you want to be able to use the narratives to show me that you're making reference to the reading. So if you are the kind of person who believes, and your history shows that you say, oh man, that strict father model, that's exactly how I was raised, then you should be able to show what kind of politics and legal narrative follows from that metaphor. You're going to be focused on domination, so you might have to examine your own bias and how you're getting privileges because you fit into the system and are kind of understand the rules of the game without ever having to learn about them. For those of you who have experienced injustice, you're more likely to identify with the nurturing parent model, and you're going to say law should be used for fairness and should be used as a guaranteed right. You need to be able to show me which readings and examples from the course support your lived experience. You should also be able to contrast, right? You should be able to look and see how these readings are in conflict with each other, and finally be able to show me that law is not one thing. It's not a universal standard. It's not a system of rules. It's not these really stupid Google responses, right? It's that you now learn and can engage with all these materials, and that you've moved up and beyond just being able to memorize definitions, that you can apply this information in this advanced class, and that you're ready for transferring or graduating from Kingsborough College, right? This is kind of thinking deeper, critically analyzing, reflecting on your own position, and be able to offer a meaningful contribution to how identities are constituted, because, right, law is a construct of all of our experiences. And so your ability to explain this helps me and other people who study law to know it better. We know how it works in real life as opposed to just how it might work if everybody was angels, as James Madison said. So I hope this is helpful and gives you an overview. So a couple students requested that, so this is kind of putting all the pieces together, reminding you what D answers look like, C answers look like, and B answers look like, and hopefully that you're getting to that A answer by showing me you can critically analyze. You want to be able to put these pieces together, use complete sentences, okay? Make sure that you're giving enough evidence from the readings, that you're quoting, that you're citing, that you're being able to show me that you're a thinking college student. I know the pandemic is difficult. I know that not every class is requiring you to think, but this class is, and I think it's good for you. I also think it's good for our society. And when I see you in the real world, I feel more comfortable knowing that you are also a civically informed human who understands how the legal system and constitutional process works in this country.